Welcome to Indus Special. I am Ejaz Haider. Since the 14th February attack in the Pulwama district of occupied Kashmir by a local Kashmiri boy, an attack which was mounted on India's Central Reserve Police Force, a paramilitary outfit, and killed 44 CRPF personnel, the BJP government has been threatening to take action against Pakistan. Indian TV channels, the studio core of India's right wing and its shrieking corps commanders have been discussing kinetic options to teach Pakistan a lesson. The last time India mobilized was in 01-02, a standoff that lasted for 10 months, cost India about $3 billion, nearly 2,000 soldiers killed during mobilization and in internal security operations in occupied Kashmir without any engagement with the Pakistan Army. India war-gamed after the political decision to mobilize, and the war-gaming threw up results that found that India couldn't get its politico-military objectives. In this program, we primarily discuss what kinetic options India has. Let it be said, however, that the issue is not what India can choose to do, but whether it can control the spiral, especially if Pakistan decides to retaliate, which it will. Given the issue at hand, we have with us Lieutenant General Ghulam Mustafa, a former Corps Commander at 10 Corps, the Corps whose area of responsibility extends along the entire line of control, Lieutenant General Waheed Arshad, former Chief of General Staff of the Pakistan Army, and Brigadier Naeem Salik, who was former Director, Arms Control Disarmament Agency at the Strategic Plans Division. Let me begin with General Ghulam Mustafa. General Mustafa, sir, surgical strikes, this is one of the things. They said last time that they did this. Fire assaults, so, long-range artillery, missiles. They were also talking about BrahMos, drones, armed drones, and then, of course, large-scale mobilization. Let's begin with large-scale mobilization. Given that you were commanding a corps back in 01-02 when they decided to mobilize. Their holding corps can be ready in about 96 hours. The strike corps 1, 2, and 21 will take about, let's say, 14 days to 20 days. They have shortened their interior lines, but there'll be no element of surprise. What could they do, and what could be our response?
To start with, I think the Indians must understand two things. That Pakistan, since it doesn't have any offensive or aggressive designs, it has always been configuring itself and its forces to be a strong defensive potential, and when needed, to be able to counterattack. Our times of response, and compared to vis-a-vis what the Indians can do, there's a time differential that India somehow or the other cannot overcome. If the Indians want to go aggressive, all they can to start with do is something across the line of control or working boundary. Coming across the international border, that is a different ball game altogether, because that actually is threatening not the subcontinent as a whole, but that actually is threatening the international peace as such. So therefore, I consider this as the last probability. What they can and what they are trying to, and what they think they can do and get away with is incursions through line of control or firefighting across the working boundary. But that again, given the kind of objectives that Pakistan has in its range, and given the kind of reaction that Pakistan can mount, that their ideas of standoff weapon system, firing from India, firing in Pakistan, actually, when the fire crosses Pakistan's line, whether it's line of control or international border, Pakistan has decided that's a war as far as Pakistan is concerned. So, going all out war, India is not in a position to do it right now.
I started with the all-out option, General Arshad, and I am, for the sake of this discussion, prepared to, at this point, not talk about the nuclear escalation. But what I really want to understand, and I think our viewers, not just in Pakistan, but across the world, wherever we be, would like to understand this, in terms of the capabilities. What exactly can India do, and what could be our response in terms of, let's say, if it actually happens, if there is a clash of arms?
I think, Ejaz, first of all, we must understand what would India like to achieve, whether they undertake a surgical strike or a fire assault, raid on posts, or mobilize and maybe undertake limited conventional operations across the international border. I think, in my view, for Indians to go the whole hog and undertake a conventional war with Pakistan in the given environment is not not a good strategic option. I don't think they'll follow that. I think for them, for the BJP government, seeing the next elections coming, and they have to satisfy their domestic sentiment also. You've seen it's all warmongering for the last so many days. I think to satisfy that, the option which they might think of is to undertake a strike across the line of control, maybe a fire raid, maybe sending troops across the line of control, undertaking a raid or something, which obviously will get retaliated by Pakistan. And Pakistan has actually given a policy statement on that by the Prime Minister. So there is no thinking that whether Pakistan should think, not think. So they'll do it. And
so the Prime Minister has given a policy statement that essentially means that General Headquarters is very clear about
General
the fact
Headquarters
that we
by now must have planned what to do in case they receive any surgical strike or raid or whatever. And like Ghulam Mustafa was saying, there are so many options available to both sides. I mean, both sides know their vulnerabilities. Both sides know what to do, where to strike when it happens. But I think what is more important is that two things. One is perhaps the Indian government would like to satisfy their domestic audience, and they need to do something or seem to be doing something strong against Pakistan. That is number one. Number two, the Indian government should, I think, and the military should think that when it starts to happen, who's going to control?
Correct.
Who's going to
that
do
was my point. It's not about what options
who's going to do escalation control, because then the dynamics will be taken over by the domestic environment of both the countries.
Correct.
As well as the international environment. So when you have a situation where the escalation slips out of hand, then it can go anywhere. I mean, and when the dynamics of such an escalation are fed by domestic environment on both sides, then both the countries would be, sort of constrained to be seen to be backing down or taking it lying down or taking whatever is thrown against them. So it has its own dynamics which get fed by the environments.
General Mustafa, clearly use of force in and of itself means nothing. You use force to do something. There is a political strategic objective. Now, for instance, last time, post-Uri, they decided to do some surgical strikes. Well, we said nothing had happened. They tried to, ingress at a couple of places. They were blocked, and there was one place where they had ingressed and then egressed and all of that, but we're not getting into that. The issue is that, fire raids or sending troops, I was watching Indian television, and some of the more sensible voices was saying that if you actually use airstrikes, manned aircraft, they could be shot down. Obviously, Pakistan has a very robust air defense system. They were saying if you send in troops, they could get captured or killed, and then it would be a spectacle. So they were proposing missile strikes, drones, and perhaps standoff strikes, airstrikes with glide bombs, so you don't actually cross the line of control or the international border. If they exercise any one of these options, singly or in tandem, what is our capability to counter that?
Two things. Pakistan can retaliate in kind, and retaliate very strongly in kind, because the onus of the whole thing is not on Pakistan, onus is totally on India. So that is one thing that the international community understands.
So they have to initiate. We are not going to initiate.
We are not going to initiate.
Okay.
Second, once they strike, let's say they carry out a kind of a massive raid across the line of control someplace, and that they can, and it's very difficult in terms of time to be able to do something within a night and get back. It's the mountainous terrain, the issue. In that terrain, for us to be able to not only halt that, but counter penetration at another point is also not ruled out, because Pakistan has that capability.
So make me understand that, as General Arshad said, since the Prime Minister has already given a statement, the General Headquarters now knows what they have to do in line with that policy statement, on the basis that India actually tries to initiate something. So are we now keeping a very close watch on their troop movement, possible troop movement, or any airlifting or any of those things? Would we already have planned that, for instance, we know the advantageous areas that they have along the line of control and the ones that we have. So have we already would have calculated that if they try to do something here, then this is exactly what we're going to do some other place?
All this kind of a war game has already been done.
Okay.
And not once, but many times. And number of options have been worked out. The orders been given very clearly that should India do this, this is what Pakistan is going to do, 1, 2, 3 things. And similarly, all other things. All those things have been worked out and they're ready. And according to my information, Pakistan's concerned elements are at place and in position to be able to undertake whatever measures have been decided. And today our National Security Committee is also meeting. It will be finalized if whatever is. So that way Pakistan, you see there's nothing, this kind of war history in Pakistan. You find a very confident, composed nation which is very sure of itself.
Okay.
And that is something that India must take into account, because you can't be sure, you can't be strong, you can't be confident unless you know exactly what India can do or what are you going to do in turn. And this escalation, as Waheed was saying, is beyond anybody's control. Second thing which we should pay some attention to is that in this, like it was in Uri, subsequently, if you recall Pathankot, this time Doval has come under tremendous criticism from India.
Yeah.
That it's his failure.
Yeah.
And any reaction that comes, I think is going to be sponsored or is going to be from that corner. What I fear more is that some of their sleeper cells which might be already existing someplace.
That is another option that they have been discussing.
They've been discussing.
Yeah.
And something spectacular in line with what we have been discussing, that they have to satisfy their domestic audience now that they have raised up the heat, they rushed up the whole thing. Something spectacular which can be seen to have achieved the kind of political objective that they have set for themselves.
That's a very important point, and I will get back to that, because interestingly enough, this is something that they have started discussing overtly. They've already been doing it covertly, but they've started discussing it overtly. We will also discuss how that impacts their whole sort of rhetoric about terrorism, and, you know, with reference to Kulbhushan Jadhav also. But, General Arshad, before I go to Brigadier Salik and, you know, discuss the strategic sort of nuclear escalation possibilities, you were the Chief of General Staff, and so that essentially meant that you coordinated and ran the Army's operations. If you were in that seat right now, post this crisis, how many phones would you be handling and what exactly would you be doing?
You know, frankly, I wouldn't be handling much really, because all instructions would have already been passed.
Okay.
And one needs to understand the dynamics of the line of control. The 10 Corps has a lot of flexibility and leeway to do a lot of things because the overarching policy is very clear, GHQ's policy. So this is concept of quid pro quo response on the line of control. And there is this concept of quid pro quo pro plus on the line of control.
Oh, okay.
So anything happening from the Indian side will be responded, has always been responded in kind, and also, as I said, quid pro quo plus. So all plans are in place, people are there, everybody knows what to do. So I think I'll be more concerned and I'll be more worried and looking very closely at the Indian conventional forces movement, their logistic movement, their forward movement along the line of control, such kinds of things, because that gives an indicator of what might come and what might not come. And as we all know, the Indian political situation is that there is this extremism, radicalism, and racism is mainstream politics in India. It's not in Pakistan. Yeah. So when it is mainstream politics, and you have this kind of situation, so you can see the mindset which is driving policy making there. So whether it is overt or it is covert, I mean, they always paint themselves into a corner, and then they don't know what to do. You look at Uri, they announced a surgical strike, didn't do anything, just did a fire raid, as far as I know. And that was responded. And Pakistan acted very maturely. I mean, they painted a surgical strike, satisfied their domestic audience, and that was the end of it. So I think
it was very interesting that the press conference their DGMO did in the morning actually talked about what they'd done. There was a text in English and then there was a text in Hindi. But he also made it very clear that he had spoken to his counterpart and informed his counterpart that as far as their operation was concerned, it was over. So it was a kind of signaling, if you will.
That it didn't do anything actually.
Yeah, that, you know, we're not looking for anything more than this.
I mean, I think we should be more concerned on two things. One is an international community also. One is that if something happens, who's going to control escalation? I mean, that's a very critical thing to happen, because then decision making is driven by non-military environment.
Yeah.
And because military only follows orders and carries out and retaliates. I mean, there are larger issues at play at that time when this escalation starts to take place. And then, you know, is it going to escalate further? Are both countries going to go to war? And if both countries go to war, then that kind of escalation is totally different. Because when both countries are going to war, then it's the notion of victory, it's war termination which come into play. And as we all know, both the countries, when this thing happens, it can escalate to any dimension.
Okay. So let me pull in Brigadier Salik here. Brigadier Salik, you have dealt with, analyzed the nuclear dimension. I had earlier said that, you know, I was asking journalists Mustafa and Arshad to talk about the possibility of large-scale mobilization, but saw the nuclear dimension. But the nuclear dimension is there. That debate was essentially as a sort of, you know, experiment into what could possibly India do and how could we retaliate at the conventional level. But since there is a nuclear dimension, what could be the play here?
Thank you, Ejaz. Actually, you see, the point is that the kind of options which Indians have been discussing and which have been discussed by our experts also, if they plan to take a localized kind of reaction across the line of control, then the nuclear dimension doesn't come into play. But if they are thinking of something more, a limited kind of operation across the international border, then the escalation dynamics will be very different. In fact, I've been watching some of the Indian TV programs, and people were talking about using BrahMos and the standoff weapons by the aircraft flying on the Indian side. That is a very different dimension in which basically the contingency plans which we were talking about, the 10 Corps and others who are all other formations which are on ground, they are prepared to meet all kind of contingencies which come through the line of control through ground operations. Mm-hmm. But if this kind of action is taken, like firing a cruise missile, now that will be a very major escalation.
Okay, so here's the thing. Here's the thing. Yeah. Since we are talking about the nuclear dimension, and this is a nuclear dyad, if you resort to missilery, especially whether it's a short-range ballistic missile or whether it's a cruise missile, how is the adversary going to figure out whether the missile has a tactical warhead or a strategic warhead?
That is the dilemma, because with the best of systems, you can at best detect the launch of a missile. But there is no technology available in the world today which can tell you what kind of warhead this incoming missile is carrying.
Correct.
So if you react to the information about the launch of a missile, it can create problems because it's a bilateral, it's a dyad, which is where both sides have nuclear weapons, and the missiles which are being fielded by both sides, they are also nuclear capable.
So the essential corollary here is that resorting to missilery can be a highly destabilizing step, and you know, on the escalation ladder.
Yeah, it can be very, very dangerous. And then some people seem to be thinking that if they use cruise missiles, probably that will not be escalatory. Whether it's cruise missile or a ballistic missile, a missile is a strategic weapon. And then Pakistan, everyone knows, has got a variety of cruise as well as ballistic missiles. There is no bar on Pakistan that if they use cruise missile, Pakistan is bound to respond with a cruise missile. Pakistan can use any missile out of its inventory, whichever suits the situation at that time. So then, obviously, this will be back and forth, and this can also escalate very quickly like the air campaign.
Absolutely. So whichever way we cut it, unless it's a very localized operation, something doesn't really cross any red line that way and can be retaliated to in terms of quid pro quo or quid pro quo plus, as General Arshad said, along the line of control. Or if they, as you mentioned, think of doing something spectacular in terms of state terrorism, some kind of blast here or some kind of, in Balochistan, or attack on army or FC convoys or some such thing. Whichever way we cut it, it is escalatory.
Yes.
And therefore, I think if to go back to, since General Arshad mentioned Prime Minister Imran Khan's speech, I think it was a balanced speech where he not only said that Pakistan is prepared to look into this, but at the same time made it very clear that in the event that you try to do some kind of adventure, Pakistan will have no option but to retaliate. I'm going to take a short break here, but at the other end of the break, we'll continue with our discussion of India's options and what Pakistan can possibly do, and also in terms of escalation, how the third parties get involved and change the entire dynamic of this game. Stay with us. Welcome back to Indus Special. We're discussing India's warmongering and the various options that India can exercise. Before we went for the break, one of the basic factors that we discussed was the possibility of escalation. But now I am joined by Helene Sejlert, who's a Swedish analyst and watches the Indian-occupied Kashmir very closely. Thank you, Helen, for being on the program. Give us a sense of what got you to start looking at the occupied Kashmir, and what are your findings?
What I find at the moment is a very, very unfair reporting on the issue. We have a lot of attention right now since the Pulwama attack. But the thing is that for Kashmir, Pulwama has been happening for the last 3 decades, every single day. 95,000 people have been killed and many thousand injured, and nothing in media, nothing in the UN, nothing in the EU. But now everyone is speaking about it, and everyone is speaking about it in very harsh terms when it comes to Kashmiris. And that is also backfiring, of course, because media in India is wild, and Kashmiris have been attacked in India, Kashmiris inside India, for example. So it's a very, very sensitive period.
So Helen, tell me, you obviously travel, you talk about this. I was also going through your Twitter timeline, which is primarily about occupied Kashmir and what's happening to the Kashmiris there. When you talk to people in Europe, do you ask them this question of why there is such silence on these atrocities? What are the reasons for that?
I think the main reason is that people in Europe actually knows nothing about Kashmir. Kashmir is totally forgotten. When it comes to brutality, we see exactly the same type of brutality that Israel is committed inside Palestine, but people are aware of that now. When it comes to Kashmir, we have the Delhi narrative. We don't hear anything from a Kashmiri angle. We don't hear about the atrocities. We don't hear about the pellet injuries. We don't hear about the torture going on. So when it comes to Kashmir, there's a blank. People are totally unaware about what is going on. So,
okay, so how would you suggest, what should, I think there's an implication here also that perhaps Islamabad hasn't really been able to, you know, get through to the European Union and other capitals. What would you suggest? What can Pakistan do, or what can the Kashmiris do to actually put this on the table and for the world to sit up and take note?
I mean, when it comes to international levels, we have seen a UN report last year that was damning and really condemning the grave atrocities committed in occupied Kashmir. EU stated yesterday that the issue needs to be solved via dialogue. Pakistan, Turkey, also Jeremy Corbyn has supported the Kashmiri people. So many have said, let's talk. The problem is that India says no. India says no all the time. And this is really the thing. We need to put pressure on India to actually, or I would rather say that we need to put pressure on our governments to put pressure on India so that they see that they are the only ones obstructing here. Kashmir and the Kashmiri people are the ones who are the main, they have the prerogative, they decide their future. But what we can do is that we try to put pressure on our governments to speak up and to support the Kashmiri people.
Apparently, the Indians have blocked your Twitter account in India. Is that correct?
That's correct. That was half a year ago. India has asked them to withhold my account in India. And that means, of course, Kashmir also then. And they have put some type of shadow ban on me as well. So my reach is much less than it was before. That is bad, but what is worse is that they are doing this all the time to Kashmiri voices. So they have all the big social media platforms, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, have basically taken down Kashmiri voices, telling about the human rights abuses inside Kashmir. So they have been restricted, they have been banned, they have been withheld. And this is a serious concern because this is since mainstream media is so, they are lousy when it comes to reporting the Kashmir issue.
That's right.
Social media has been the forum for Kashmiris to tell about the atrocities committed. So this is really a serious problem. And of course, it's against their own statutes, the social media platforms.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Helene Sejlert. That was Helene Sejlert giving us her insights into the atrocities in Kashmir. One of the implications here was that probably we're not really reaching out to the foreign capitals. Is that correct?
I think it's more than correct. It's been kind of a huge failure on Pakistan's part not to let the world know what is happening in Kashmir. Not only that, our Foreign Office failed it. I think our media, this probably is the only channel which actually is going across being heard by international community. Whatever else we do is stays within Pakistan. It's about Pakistan mostly. Our education system doesn't bring up this kind of education to our children, what is actually the issue in Kashmir. When we go on the international stage, quite a few of our politicians don't understand what actually is the issue. And when it comes to Foreign Office, there again it's a huge failure. It has to be consistent policy.
But here's the thing, General Arshad, what General Mustafa is saying, and I agree with him, but the Ministry of Foreign Affairs has some really fine diplomats. But I have a feeling that at the policy level, we've been trying to sort of soft pedal this issue for a long time. And it could possibly also be because we thought that perhaps we could sit at the table with the Indians and, you know, we could work it out. Do you think that is one of the reasons?
I have a slightly different view of the whole thing. One is that Kashmir is not a new issue. It's not that the world doesn't know about Kashmir.
Okay.
Pakistan's foreign policy and Pakistan's political voice has a limit, obviously, for so many reasons.
Correct.
The world still looks at Pakistan through the prism of terrorism, whatever is happening in Afghanistan, internal issues of Pakistan. Indians have been playing this terrorism card vis-a-vis Kashmir and so on and so on. But I think what is more worrying is that it's not that the Indians there are no foreign diplomats in India or there are no foreign diplomats in Pakistan. Everybody knows what is happening.
Is this the economic differential?
I think the world doesn't really care much about what is happening in Kashmir. Otherwise, I mean, the British High Commissioner in India, for example, or the US ambassador in Kashmir, in India, and Pakistan, other EU ambassadors and other world ambassadors exactly know what is happening in Kashmir, especially out of the UN report on human rights violations last year. So, I mean, they are the ones who are supposed to actually feed the governments on what is actually happening on ground. And the governments are supposed to take notice and, you know, see the environment and then issue statements or whatever. But even now, when you look at the statements coming out from various capitals like EU and Britain and USA, they are more worried on what is going to happen on the escalation thing and war between Pakistan and India. Nobody is talking of the actual plight of the Kashmiris.
Which is the central issue.
That why Pulwama happened.
Precisely.
So I think, I mean, and they are worried more on that the two nuclear armed countries should not go to war. But nobody is bothered about why this thing happened. As Helene said, I mean, look at the atrocities being committed for the last so many years. And 95,000 people dead. And nobody is bothered about it. I mean, yes, you can say that maybe the foreign policy or diplomacy has not been very aggressive. So many reasons they've tried their best, I think. Not the Kashmir Committee, let me say that, of National Assembly, but the Foreign Office has tried its best. But then it's an issue which is a live issue on the world stage. I mean, nobody wants to take notice of it.
So, since PSL is also happening, let me use a cricketing analogy. When you cannot get a pair out and they are, you know, well entrenched, playing very cautiously, and you make it happen. You change the bowling, you can change the fielding, you can, you know, move from pace to fast to, you know, spin and all of that. Now, there are certain determinants there. India is growing economically, it enters the world, it has strategic partnership and the rest of it. But we need to then begin to change the template. And I had suggested during one of my presentations, incidentally at the National Defense University, that we need to begin to recognize Kashmiris as a political movement. We need to get Azad Kashmir government to actually, because it is hamstrung by so many factors and we all know that. We need to get rid of that if we want to get the political and moral high ground on this. And then, because every time something like this happens, India very cleverly makes it into an India-Pakistan thing. And the idea of Kashmiri self-determination is pushed on the back burner. And I would like to, since both of you very senior military officers held, you know, very sensitive appointments, is there a possibility of people like you to actually tell the policymakers that, you know, we need to begin to change the template and start doing something different?
I think we should. I think it be over to not ourselves, but also the institution and the people. Two things are very critical. One is that the national narrative, as you were saying, I think we all are saying the same thing. There has to be a national narrative as to what is issue of Kashmir and where it figures out as far as overall Pakistan is concerned. And the second thing is that it's a rhetoric or beaten track. We'll talk to India, we'll discuss India with India, we'll have this composite dialogue, and India just parries that thing, and then we are still stumped. Something new. And something new exactly is that the Kashmiris must now be allowed to take up this whole issue as an issue which is theirs.
Absolutely.
And Pakistan becomes a supporting element in that.
Absolutely.
And in any case, if you look at the whole thing, by having got the 25,000 people killed, Kashmiris have proved beyond any doubt that they are the determining factor now. Let them be the determining factor. I think we built the whole policy around this fact that people within Pakistan and Azad Kashmir and in the Indian-held Kashmir, they start talking about Kashmiris in the lead, a solution which the Kashmiris want.
Okay. Let me go to Brigadier Salik. Brigadier Salik, once again, I want to go back to the nuclear dimension. And so, conceptually and theoretically, during the Cold War, for instance, there was a lot of talk about how can you fight a nuclear war and actually win it. So, there was movement from counter-value to counter-force targeting and, improving the circular error probable of the missiles to have, better strikes and multiple warheads and the rest of it. But at some point, it was decided that all of it was, essentially a lot of hot air, and you cannot really fight a nuclear war and win. So you had the center, which was stable, and politically and strategically, the periphery got destabilized. Do you think, India and Pakistan, and I'm sure the planners know all this theory. So I'm assuming that better sense will prevail, and there'll be no escalation to that point. Would you agree with me?
I think the idea you were referring to, this conclusion was reached during the Reykjavik meeting between Ronald Reagan and Gorbachev, where they said that nuclear war cannot be won, so therefore should not be fought. Yeah. And that then led to the INF Treaty.
Correct.
I think that conclusion was reached by them after a lot of crises, and they had tried different combinations and different plans and different strategies, and they found out that actually at the end of the day, there'll be no victor if there is a nuclear war. I think that lesson is very well understood by India and Pakistan as well. But what we have not learnt is that whether we like it or not, one of the effects of nuclearization is that it tends to freeze the status quo, particularly if it is a territorial dispute between the two countries. And the option of using military force to resolve issues or to achieve political objectives is then not available. So therefore, the only option is to sit across the table and resolve the disputes politically as far as you can. I think the earlier the Indians and Pakistanis come to this realization, the better it would be. Because I don't think so. Even the Indians, despite all the rhetoric which is coming out of Indian media, I don't think so that people can be so stupid as to venture into a nuclear exchange at whatever level, because then that is the end game. And as Herman Khan said, that after a nuclear exchange, the living will envy the dead. So yeah. There is going to be no loser and no victors. Everybody will suffer. And I think that realization should be there, and people should come to terms with this. The point that once the stability happens at the strategic level, it then leaves very few options for exercise of military instrument at the conventional level, even at the limited war option, because then limited war per se is different from limited war under a nuclear overhang.
Correct.
So the escalation can never be ruled out. So then it goes to the sub-conventional level. And that is what is happening here. I think unless the two sides discuss these issues and try to find negotiated settlement to the disputes, this danger will always be there. And once you get on to that spiral from sub-conventional to limited conventional and then to conventional war, ultimately the nuclear escalation then will become uncontrollable.
But I still think, I mean, given, for instance, after Kargil, the Indian planners, and I'm talking about the military planners, started thinking about limited war. I also remember there was a paper read out by their vice chief on this issue, They've been talking about cold start, the independent, battle groups, then they changed the nomenclature to proactive operations and the rest of it. So there seems to be a certain sense that perhaps a short, sharp kind of strike can be made to punish Pakistan without really crossing the red line. But here's the thing. We have been managing risk through ambiguity, and we really haven't spelled out our red lines. The only I remember the only exception being an interview that General Kidwai once gave to two visiting Italian physicists, where he talked about, he gave 4 red lines of sorts. So my point being that there is still some kind of thought that a limited war can be waged, and somehow it will not lead to escalation. Do you think that that sense is correct as far as my reading of the literature is concerned?
It may be the literature, because you see, how else do the Indian Army justify their existence? Because there's 1.2 million people in arms, and they have no role to play. So they have to justify their role by bringing up these kind of ideas that even despite the nuclearization, this can be done and this cannot be done. And they talked of limited war. They started talking about it immediately after Kargil. In fact, more formally from February 2000 onwards, BP Malik and George Fernandez.
Yeah.
And then once they faced the situation in 2001-2002 military standoff, they could not actualize it. So then they took refuge behind the long mobilization time of the Indian offensive forces. So then they went on to this cold start, but they in the hearts of heart, they know that none of these concepts can be actualized under a nuclear environment, because the risk of escalation cannot be ruled out. The point is that you may plan a war as a limited war, but you cannot anticipate the reactions of the other side.
Absolutely.
As someone said very, I think appropriately, that war is more like a woodcutter's axe than a surgeon's scalpel. So you cannot have precise, fine cuts. It is a very bloody, messy affair. And even if you think that you can have a controlled operation, whether it is within the framework of proactive operations, cold start or whatever, the escalation is beyond your control. The biggest difficulty is how do you declare victory and then call off the war. That is not...
Absolutely. Or as Mike Tyson said, everyone has a plan until he is hit. So, but thank you so much. That was Brigadier Salik. General Arshad, the idea that a war can be fought, we've realized, is not workable. If you take limited action, it doesn't really change anyone's behavior. So how can the world convince India that the only way out is A, to ensure that Kashmiris are not repressed, and B, to talk with Pakistan, with the Kashmiris as a very important part of those conversations? How can that be done? I mean, I'm sure it can't be done until May, until they have their elections, but post-May, is there a possibility? Is there something we can do to, somehow get them to the table?
I think it is important to understand, and a lot of analysts have been making this point. Even the Prime Minister alluded to it in his address of introspection by the Indians. Yeah. I think Indians need to realize, I'm sure they know about it, that there is a generational change of political movement in Kashmir, in occupied Kashmir. Now the movement is in the hands of the same very generation on which the Indian government had spent billions of rupees in education and facilities and all those things. They have turned against them, and they need to realize why has it happened. Yeah, even the next generation, which are boys from 8 to 14 years of age, you can see them on the streets. Yeah. So, I mean, future generations are now leading the movement, so to speak. The Hurriyat... That
takes care of another 30 years.
So, I mean, there has to be some introspection. That is number one. And that would lead to only one solution. That is a politically negotiated solution. Yeah. the Indians really can't kill their way through Kashmir, or they can't fatigue the Kashmiri population as the whole strategy was, that okay, let them continue and they'll fatigue themselves out. And that was based on, after 96, there was a gap of 8 to 10 years when nothing was happening and everybody thought that the movement is fatigued, and look what has happened. Yeah. So I think
it has become more potent.
More potent. So I think the international community needs to understand that this situation might lead to a war between India and Pakistan. And the war is not going to take both the countries anywhere, neither the world. The only way is to, and as everybody is saying, the Kashmiris now need to take the lead role in what should happen to their area.
Absolutely.
You see, unless they are given a lead role by the international community, by both India and Pakistan, and we need to understand that it is important to understand what do they really want. Okay. And only then one can then sit on the table and see, okay, let's go from there. This is what they want, have a negotiated solution. There's no other way. I mean, whether it's a limited war or a surgical strike or a fire raid or a conventional war, it will have retaliation, it will escalate. There's no way it's not going to escalate.
Absolutely. We are also joined by Gulpreet Singh. Thank you, Mr. Singh, for being on the program. Mr. Singh, incidentally, is based in Chandigarh. Give me a sense of what you guys are doing in relation to threats against the Kashmiri students.
Yeah, actually, we were informed by the Kashmiri students that there are not a fixed number. I'm just telling you appropriately, it was around 400 to 500 students here in Standard, who have come from other corners of this outskirts of Punjab, like other states like Haryana,
okay,
this Himachal and Uttarakhand. So they were stranded and they had taken, abode in this Gurdwaras nearby in Chandigarh and Mohali.
Okay.
So we were informed that a number of students are staying here. They are very scared and they need to go back to their homes. So we arranged some sort of transportation and other means, secure means, so that they can go to their homes safely.
Okay. I think that's a great, that's a great to do. And is this something which you're doing institutionally, Mr. Singh? Do you have an organization or you're doing it individually? How is it working?
So we have an organization here in India, and it is on international basis also. It's Khalsa Aid.
Okay.
So we are working with them. So it is an organized institutional thing that we are doing, and we are helping other Kashmiri students to reach their homes.
Okay, so what is your sense of how long will this sort of, atmosphere of fear go on? Because I think what we are witnessing, through the Indian media, by the way, because we have no other source into what's happening there, it seems that the right wing is really up and, baying for blood.
Sir, actually, we are an organization who works for humanity first. We don't have any grudges with any left wing or right wing or any other wing. We are an organization, as the name suggests, and as the heading, we have to recognize all human race as one.
Correct.
So the thing is, what right wing is doing or what left wing is doing, we have nothing to do about it. We have to just help the people who actually need our help on ground zero. Okay. As we were hearing this news, people want to go home, they are stranded, they are being threatened, or they are scared. So we just try to arrange the means by which they can get to their homes safely.
Absolutely.
As they were not feeling safe.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mr. Singh. Great work. That was Gulpreet Singh from Chandigarh. Very quickly, General Mustafa, any last thoughts before I wrap up the program?
Please do not rule out a miscalculation. While we're talking all sane, logical, Saleh, yourself, Waheed and myself, don't rule out this madness that is caught on in India's extreme right wing and this historical baggage which continues to force them to teach a lesson to Pakistan, to the Muslims, to the minorities. And as a geography, Pakistan actually lies across the routes which India needs very badly for itself, because India has a larger design. They want to be a international and so-called a superpower, and for that they think Pakistan falls under their. Therefore, we should not rule out any miscalculation on their part, while this all thing is right. And that miscalculation is what Pakistan must worry about.
Okay. Miscalculation can always happen. There's also the fear of what you talked about, a spectacular, covert, state-sponsored terrorist attack. This is all we have for today from Indus Special. We'll see you tomorrow. Until then, it's goodbye.